Hello, everybody. Welcome to the digital payments boom, playing catch up with the giants. My name is Christy Duncan, founder, CEO of Women in Payments, and I'm delighted to be here today. I think we can all agree that this past year has been truly extraordinary. And in today's discussion, we're going to look at some of the success stories that we've seen in the digital payments market over the past year. We'll also explore issues around regulation, emerging markets, and offer insights to what we might see in the future. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. I'm going to invite each to come onto the screen and tell us a little bit about what they do and introduce themselves. Keith Gross, why don't we start with you?
Hi, Chrissy. Thanks for having me. As you said, 2020 changed the way people and businesses run their financial lives, but managing money is still too hard for most, and open banking is helping change that. And Plaid is one of the leading open banking platforms where I manage the UK and European business. Great to be here.
Welcome, delighted to have you here. Miles, would you like to come on screen and introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, thank you for having me on the panel. And so I'm Miles Stevenson, I'm the CEO of Modular. We're an APA payments platform, and we're changing the way businesses access payments by enabling them to integrate payments in the way they want to and access the services in the way they want to, enabling clients to automate, embed, and also build new payment propositions. And we're doing that for the likes of QuickBooks, Sage, and Revolut. And in a similar way to that Keith describes, we had a very sort of strong 2020 with people starting to think about how they change the way they do things from a payments perspective. So glad to be here. Thank you.
Indeed. Welcome. Delighted to have you. Neil, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Thank you, Christy. I'm Neil Harris. I'm the Group Chief Commercial Officer at GPS, or Global Processing Services, the full name. We're an issuer processor powering many of today's digital banks and fintechs on a global level, such as we share a customer with Revolut, with Miles and Modular, where we power Starling Bank, Curve, Razor FinTech, a number of organizations, all seeking to improve lives through technology.
Fantastic. Welcome, Neil. And last but certainly not least, Sophie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Christy, and hello, everybody. So I'm Sophie Guibaud. I'm the Chief Growth Officer of OpenPates. We provide access through APIs to businesses, to corporate accounts, FX, card processing, and open banking, enabling essentially businesses to use banking and payment for themselves as well for their end customers. And previously, I was at Fidor and Bankable, doing banking as a service for the past 10 years.
Fantastic. Well, I am so delighted to have this superlative panel today of amazing fintech leaders from around the world. It's going to be a great discussion. So let's kick us off and talk a little bit about the past year. I know there's just not enough superlatives to talk about the past year. We've seen massive change and an unprecedented rate of acceleration, the pace of innovation, and the adoption of e-commerce, contactless payments, and fintech in general. So let's talk about some of the successes that we've seen over the past year. Miles, can I get you to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned briefly, it's been a sort of whirlwind year with obviously a lot to manage and deal with, but also a significant acceleration in what we've been doing. From some, I guess I could describe it as from some very small examples, but really meaningful examples, through to some more significant change. So if I take a really small practical example, one of the areas we serve are accounting software providers and payroll providers, integrating payables, receivables, payroll. And pre-pandemic, the setup was very much focused on being in the office, accountants serving SMEs in that office environment, through to the pandemic not being able to do that. So having systems integrated, being able to process payments automatically became a critical item, something that may not have been obvious, may have been obvious perhaps to some people, but being able to bring that together in a simple way for a small business and for their accountants is perhaps a micro example at that level, but really important. Through to what we've seen as the other end is people starting to accelerate transformation projects through to how they rebuild platforms, really replace platforms, which have typically been multi-year decisions that have accelerated very quickly through last year.
Yeah, I love that acceleration of innovation, and just digitization is fantastic. Sophie, would you like to talk a little bit about some of the successes in the past year? Oh, Sophie looks like she's frozen. Keith, why don't we move on to you? We'll come back to Sophie.
So,
sorry, Sophie.
Yes.
Would you like to talk about some of your successes over the past year?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry about that. So what I was meaning is that over the past 12 months, what we have seen is really an acceleration from businesses asking not only like the payout part of the journey, but the pay-in part as well, which means that essentially, like, while we were servicing crypto platforms, like large ones, 12 months ago, we were seeing them as solutions, then some FX, and essentially over the past 12 months, they have started accelerating for more services, going towards really these embedded finance journeys that we are seeing more and more traction about, and I'm specifically talking about card processing and open banking.
Fantastic. I love that embedded payments, embedded finance concept, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Keith, would you like to talk about some of your successes in the last year?
I think maybe rather even frame it than successes, just thinking about how much last year changed. You had institutions of society, which were your neighborhood bank branches, that have been closed for a year, and people haven't gone into them. Businesses haven't been able to access them. That just fundamentally changes how people run their financial lives. And I think the adoption, and then the other panelists have said this, acceleration of that adoption of the underlying infrastructure around open banking payments and open banking data has been a key story of that. I think my favorite stat of the past year is that the fastest growing segment for PayPal last spring in the first lockdown was people over 50 years old. You had whole generations that hadn't used fintech moving on to fintech. And I think that's changing the trajectory of financial technology.
Yeah, that whole silver tech migration has been fantastic. And it's really brought in a whole section of the population that was perhaps reticent before the pandemic. So it's great. It's welcomed new users and opened up new opportunities. Neil, do you want to talk a little bit about the last year and what you've seen from your side?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like everyone, the last year's been an absolute whirlwind in many different ways. A few curveballs being thrown at the industry and certainly at some of the kind of context, not outside of the COVID environment as well. So successes, GPS are a scaling organization, really proud in terms of our global growth, despite the adversity in which we find ourselves. In the last year, we've opened up 2 offices, one which is a satellite office to our Singapore office in Sydney, Australia. And that's all around helping facilitate our customers from a kind of a 24/7 support module, follow the sun model. We've always offered that 24/7, but actually having people on the other side of the planet certainly helps enormously to provide the best level of service. Also, we've got a bit of a mantra as an organization. You know, it's a global platform, but delivered locally. So we're really proud to continue that and to make those investments as required, and be in a position actually to make those investments in ourselves and ultimately for the service that we provide to our customers. And that's, you know, last year we've won a number of awards. We won 11 awards across the industry for, you know, multiple variants of either programs that we've delivered or helped to deliver, or indeed about us organizationally, about our, you know, our growth and expansion. So that was certainly very exciting. And then finally, I think the human impact of COVID has affected us all, and actually to be part of some of the initiatives that our customers have rolled out. I'll cite Starling Bank with the Connected Card program. You know, we got that thing running up in 2 weeks, whereby, you know, COVID hit. There was a big challenge. Started and but they got it out in 2 weeks, such that they can provide better service to those people who are in very vulnerable and difficult situations. So very proud of that as well.
Fantastic. Yes, I think the whole financial inclusion piece is something we don't want to lose sight of. I also want to pick up on your point there, Neil, about I almost want to call 2020, 2021 as the year of success for fintech. I mean, we've seen such amazing support and growth from fintechs. I mean, Plaid now with your amazing, multi-billion-dollar valuation. Modular's got a recent investment from FIS. Even GPS has had some fantastic support recently from Visa. So fintech is really, really coming of age, and it's fantastic to see. Before we go on, I'd like to invite the audience at any point to submit questions for this fantastic panel. We'd love your questions. I would be delighted to answer them. So let's move on to the whole concept of regulation. And I know each of you has had some challenges one way or another with regulatory issues. Certainly the UK and the EU benefit from a progressive regulatory regime which favors innovation and competition, and yet fintechs are often challenged with issues such as lack of enforcement or passporting issues, discrimination, among others. Can you share with the audience the regulatory challenges that you might have faced and how you'd like the regulators to respond? Perhaps I could get you to kick us off here, Miles.
Yeah, sure. I think for me, to start with, I think it's important in framing it in the Modular would definitely like more of the same, because I think a lot has been achieved. So if you look at whether much talked about BST2 and open banking, but perhaps some of the other less well-known areas such as access to the Bank of England, which we have as a non-bank FI, it is just really forward-thinking. And so for us, it's thinking what's next? What else can the regulators do? The central banks can do. The government can do. However, on the other side, there are then the dangers that we get into a little bit of a sort of halfway house, where there's this great sort of innovation, great momentum, great change, which enables us to, quite frankly, exist and do what we do, which is brilliant. Then we sort of start to hit some of the challenges of how do you really make it work? And I could probably go into lots of detail, but I'll save the audience from it around how the working within the Bank of England works around things like the net sender cap and liquidity, which was designed for banks and not for non-banks. So there's lots of sort of detail there that can be improved. And then things like enforcement around acceptance are really important, and one that's very pertinent for us is IBAN acceptance, and this is prior to Brexit and some of the now cross-border challenges between the UK and the EU. But even within the EU, and when the UK was still part of it, but still now within the EU, not having universal acceptance of individual country IBANs across the EU is I think a very high-profile example. And for me, that one highlights perhaps the concern I have about it, that we've got this change that sometimes then is, and these friction points that is put at the door of fintech, when really it's not fintech, it's fintech trying to use the system properly and in a good way. But the friction point sometimes, well, that's new and that's different, therefore it's not working, when really it's actually perhaps the regulation not being enforced and the system not being used properly. So for me, lots of positives, but lots of opportunity to make it even better.
Well, those are all great points, Miles, and for sure we need to work on that. I think regulation is something that's constantly evolving. Keith, do you have any comments to weigh in there?
I think the thing I'd echo there is regulation done correctly builds trust, brings legitimacy to a space, which then increases investment and increases adoption. So I'd echo Miles that I think regulation is good. It just needs to be done correctly. The thing that I'm most interested to see right now for the open banking space are two things. One is further enforcement of PSD2 in continental Europe. I think the UK has taken a great lead here, but I think there are definitely markets where PSD2 could be higher quality in continental Europe. And I think regulators should step in and enforce the regulations there. I think the other thing is it'll be interesting to see where the UK goes through smart divergence now that they're not part of the European Union, and whether there are ways to accelerate some trends in that way. But one of the interesting things that Plaid has to deal with, being a platform that operates in the US, Canada, UK, continental Europe, is abstract to like comply with regulations in every market than trying to extract away to the lowest common denominator and provide that simple service. And that's honestly where a lot of the value is, because this is complex and it is different market by market. But I think we're moving in the right direction from open banking perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And that's one of the value adds that fintechs bring to the table, is being able to simplify and find that lowest common denominator. But you talked about something, Keith, that I wonder if you could unpack just a little bit for the audience, this whole concept of smart divergence. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think now if you think about in the post-Brexit world, and there are all sorts of challenges that came with that, but maybe one of the opportunities now is the UK can make changes to their regulatory environment in a faster way than maybe they could have previously. And so I think the concept of smart divergence is, where are they going to take that, be it PSD2 or other areas, in terms of where the UK can update their regulation to be fintech friendly and accelerate the adoption of fintech, given it's one of the sort of leading lights of London particularly, but the UK more broadly.
Yeah, fantastic. Neil, do you want to talk a little bit about regulatory changes and how they've impacted you with GPS?
Yeah, I mean, we're just taking a step back. I think it's really important. We've all touched on the size and scale of the UK financial services sector, but I think it's probably important to recognise that it actually accounts for nearly 9.4% of the UK GDP, and it's one of the largest globally. So in the UK, it represents about 140 billion pounds compared to Germany, which is 80 billion, and France is 50 billion. So that powerhouse that we have in London from a regulatory and skill set, that hotbed of talent that we've got in the UK and London is absolutely key. Obviously, with Brexit coming into play, sorry, I've mentioned the B word, but the passporting rights have been a huge challenge, not specifically for GPS as an organisation. We don't passport. We don't need to passport from a technology perspective, but certainly for our FIs and MBFIs and issuing banks that sort of span across Europe. There's been huge additional cost and complexity because of the lack of measures and actually visibility of actually what does it mean from a Brexit perspective. As I say, London's a hotbed of talent, and it has really been a launch pad for fintech. But the regulations or the lack of clarity on passporting have really created that new cost. From a challenge perspective, it has created that new cost dimension for financial services providers. So my ask of the regulators would be to acknowledge the power of passporting. The power of that passport. It sounds like Darth Vader, something he'd say, but there are the power of the passporting laws that we had, and perhaps to Miles's point, I do think there's opportunity within that, because we had passporting regulation that worked really well, that opened up new competitions, new markets, new opportunities for organisations. So in the same way as we've got smart divergence, perhaps we need a smart passport where the FCA or other European regulators can actually work with other like-minded, forward-thinking regulators such as MAS or in Singapore to create a gateway for passporting the market across Southeast Asia, to help create these corridors outside of not just passporting within the UK and Europe, but also on a more global level. So, as we all know, there were huge communities of people in the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, where there's still a huge number of unbanked and underserved populations. So having that expertise coupled with those abilities to create those new channels, whilst encouraging competition and kind of interoperability around the regulation, I think that's absolutely key. One thing that we found as an organisation going into so many different jurisdictions is that even though there may be centralised governance and regulation, they're all very different, and there is huge complexity, and where there is complexity, there's cost. But there's also opportunity to improve and develop without jeopardising, to Keith's point, the sovereign states as they exist, but also the importance of that regulation.
So that's getting into another whole topic that we're going to explore even further, Neil, which is a great topic, and that is the whole concept of emerging markets and where do we go from here. Sophie, I don't want to leave you out of the conversation here. You got some challenges perhaps with regulatory issues with OpenPay. Do you want to talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, with pleasure, Christy. Actually, picking up on a bit everybody's point, I would say, like, as an organization, of course, there has been, as part of Brexit, quite a lot of costs associated to the end of participating, which encompass securing a license in continental Europe or Europe, plus all the overheads like associated to that. So I think, like, to the point of Neil and Keith, like smart passporting is definitely something that could be key. Now I think a lot of organizations have already made the effort to actually go to Europe, but I think going to other geographies to actually enable trade and competition is actually a great idea. Piggybacking on the point of Miles on essentially IBAN discrimination, I would even go further than refusing the IBANs, which is quite radical and that we have noticed for some of our clients. But also actually the extra cost that some of our customers are experiencing now due to the usage of GB IBANs, which are now unregulated, and which means that European banks can apply, or receiving European banks can apply some specific fees or other fees than the one applied in Europe. So I think it's actually a point of attention for the regulator to for the UK to remain competitive with GB IBANs. And last point, leveraging on what Keith has mentioned and the importance of regulation, I think, and also in parallel to my earlier point on embedded finance, I'm very much of a believer of what Angela Strange is saying, that every company will be a fintech. We are like seeing a move towards that from brands, from vertical SaaS company, etc. And regulation is key and will always be key, essentially. So, of course, fintechs needs to work hand in hand with regulators to actually empower that, because actually making a regulation simple and accessible and keeping on an agent model and even going further will be very key for enabling all companies to become fintechs in the next few years.
Thanks for that, Sophie. Yes, I'm hearing some really common themes here about regulation and enforcement and consistency, and the concept of smart divergence and smart passporting is also something we might invite our regulators to consider. I'd like to move on now and talk about embedded payments in finance. And we've seen some really interesting announcements lately. The partnership between Amazon and Goldman Sachs, the Stripe Treasury launch, which gives merchants access to financial products which are embedded into Stripe services. So let's talk a little bit about how we see embedded payments playing out in the market. I know, Sophie, you've got some interesting things to talk about here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's the topic I'm passionate about. Beyond just OpenPay is just seeing those market trends playing up. And I think a point worth mentioning is that there is, of course, the launch of Stripe Treasury, which is extremely exciting, but it's actually the power of it, because Stripe Treasury is itself powering Shopify, which has hundreds of thousands of merchants. So if you think about what those new banks have, or old banks that just moved into banking as a service have achieved, so namely Goldman Sachs, Citi, Barclays, by powering Stripe, essentially they are like launching into new business models, leveraging a total new way to distribute their services, by leveraging the power of companies that already have the audience, the knowledge of the customer base, and just opening the doors. So I think we are just at the beginning of those game-changing partnerships, essentially. I think play to go into it just by the distribution power that those brands have. Because essentially the business proposition of those brands is to provide payments and banking exactly where the consumer needs it, essentially.
Yeah, it almost sounds like the battle of the brands. As well, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Keith, did you have anything to add on embedded payments and finance? Certainly, I think with the whole Plaid concept.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is where open banking and platforms like Plaid and Modular and others play such an important role. Really, what's happening is that both as a small business or as a consumer, your bank account is now becoming something that you can plug into any application and service. And what that ends up leading to is you can enable instant payment experiences, faster cash flow, lower costs, and you're just starting to really fundamentally change the way payments are used for pay-ins, payouts, account funding, e-commerce, and I think it's just early days for this. I truly think that it's going to be something that feels very normal to just encounter banking and being able to connect your bank account into almost any technology app that you already use in the near future.
So exciting. Miles, did you want to weigh on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with everything that's been said as you expect. And to Keith's point about how this, and Sophie's point, how this all comes together over the next few years and how people experience, how they use payments and interact with it is going to change fundamentally. So we see it almost like it's going to be a perfect storm. There's a perfect storm brewing with all of these components coming together. We talked about the regulation already, that's enabling a different approach, different thinking. There's some of the sort of legacy incumbent approach, which is struggling with it, and for good reason, and therefore there's opportunity to change that, think about it differently. And then most importantly, the third components of that perfect storm is there's this massive demand from people, from businesses, to experience, or the way they experience payments, to be in a different way, and that's opportunity to integrate into any software platform. And I think all of those things coming together are all building up, and they're brewing really nicely into this perfect storm that's it's coming, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, indeed. And this perfect storm, I think the fintechs are ready, willing, and able to jump in and meet those new demands. Last but not least, Neil, did you want to talk a little bit about embedded finance and payments?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's thanks, Chrissy. I mean, there's no question as to why Goldman and others are investing and looking at it. By 2030, research has shown that our expectations that the market cap of embedded finance is going to peak at about $3.6 trillion in terms of value. So it's a huge market potential and a huge growth area for organizations. We're seeing right now already, we kind of, as an organization, we're almost a part of the invisible banking network already. We're part of the pipework that just makes it happen. People don't necessarily understand the complexities of what an issuer processor is, or how an issuing bank actually does what they do when they process their payments. They just know when it doesn't work, and that's an incredibly important thing in terms of what we deliver. But
Right.
Where we're seeing, from I like to talk about more invisible banking than embedded finance, because that's ultimately what the consumer sees. It's they see nothing. It just happens, and we're seeing a number of e-commerce merchants, retailers embedding lending at the checkout. So we've got a number of organizations across the globe, in Europe, in Southeast Asia. We had the first buy now, pay later program go live last year in New Zealand. We've got the first in Japan as well. So helping those organizations, those merchants, and the support chain around them, actually simplifying the checkout process, and ultimately it increases the conversion, the sales conversion, because there's less friction. It's much more simple, streamlined for the user, and gives them that choice.
Okay, I'm going to hold you there, Neil. Sorry, this is so fantastic, and I can't believe 30 minutes have passed already. We've got 10 minutes left, and I want to talk about emerging markets, and I want to talk about where to from here. So I know that many of you are expanding into new global markets outside the UK and the EU, yet these markets are often so different different regulations, different payment rails, different technology, different cultural norms, different languages, to get down to really basics. But can you talk about your key learnings in these markets and what advice you might offer to others who might be contemplating expansion to these markets? I'm going to get you to speak briefly to this. Neil, do you want to kick us off here?
Sure, can do. So we're really proud to be an export champion with the Department of International Trade. So we were given that honour about 18 months ago.
Well done.
Really proud to be founded in the UK and playing a pivotal role at the epicenter of the fintech revolution in the UK, Europe, and globally. Just to not to labour the point of the a global platform delivered locally, but it's incredibly important. Our strategy for global expansion, albeit disrupted, I would say, by COVID and made much harder by the COVID environment, has gone exceptionally well. We last year we won the leading emerging payments organisation as well as the best market expansion programme. So from an expanding organisation, and we basically go where our customers, where we see opportunity or where our customers want us to go. So leveraging that experience and the maturity of the fintech ecosystem is really important. The regulatory differences are incredibly hard to manage. As I mentioned before, the regulatory landscape is incredibly fragmented, and that's the beauty of the organisations such as GPS, because we work with so many different regulators across the globe. We've got that highest benchmark of compliance to serve our customers, and with the locally served aspect, we've also got the people there to actually support them as well.
Okay, thanks for that, Neil. Keith, do you want to talk a little bit about your learnings and what advice you might offer to other fintechs expanding globally?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I boil it down to a couple of I guess tips, for lack of a better word. One is find global partners, particularly for key parts of your infrastructure. You don't want to have to redo partnerships or redo building every time you go to a new location. So make sure that you've designed your company in terms of a tech stack for expansion. The second thing is, don't assume that you can learn a culture from abroad. You need local people, boots on the ground. You need to understand how markets are different, because I think fundamentally some of these emerging markets are going to skip right over the traditional financial services ecosystem and go directly from unbanked to fintech. And so you need to go and really be on the ground to understand how that transformation is happening.
Yeah, I love that. We're seeing that in some of these emerging markets, certainly in India and Africa. It's really exciting to see. And it challenges us in the Western world to think outside of our normal box. Last but not least, Sophie, did you want to talk a little bit about learnings, what you might share for other fintechs expanding to global markets?
So just a quick follow-up on what Keith mentioned. Fully agree on the global partnerships. I still believe we need also local partnerships, because essentially the payment experience is so still fragmented that at some point I think you still need some local schemes to be able to really provide the local experience. And it goes back with what he has just been mentioning on playing local and not only global. But overall, my point would be, you need to develop a strong partnership strategy, because payments is really all about partnership, and winning is all about winning in payment will be all about partnerships.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Sophie. So we've got 6 minutes to tie up here, and it's fantastic because I'm so excited to talk about where to from here. We've talked so much about regulatory issues and opportunities for smart diversion, smart passporting, embedded payments, embedded finance, partnerships that we should be contemplating both locally at a local level and when we expand globally. The whole opportunities of leapfrogging beyond our existing infrastructure, and in fact to new markets where they might not have existing infrastructure, they can dive right into the new digital world. Let's talk about what you're most excited about for the payments market in the next 3 years. Knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself a year ago. Miles, do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, sure. I think for me, it comes back to that analogy we were using earlier about the perfect storm, about all these components coming together and being able to judge the timing. And I think what we also linking back to the impact of last year, that it's accelerated the forming of that perfect storm, and just knowing the benefit of hindsight of knowing that timing, and therefore the preparation and when to really be prepared to accelerate alongside the market is something looking back that is key. But we find ourselves in a really fascinating and interesting place, and I think looking forward, there is this just amazing opportunity for payments to be part of literally every software platform and every software business to become a payments company, and that's having been in payments for a long time now. It's fantastic to see.
So exciting! Thanks for that, Miles. Keith, did you want to weigh in on where you see the market going in the next few years?
Yeah, I think I'd think about the advice I would have given myself if I could go back in time as well, which is think about the trends that are inevitable and invest ahead of demand. And so I think fundamentally embedded finance and open banking payments are inevitable trends that are happening. And it's worth investing now because they're going to be huge in the next 10 years. I think fundamentally financial services and payments just get great APIs and will be embedded to meet users and small businesses where they already are. And if you're not on board with that trend, eventually you're going to either have to get on board or get left behind. And so I'm excited.
Fantastic. Sophie.
Yes.
The advice that you gave yourself a year ago?
I would like just to follow up on the trends, if you don't mind, Christy, just the 10,000 feet outlook, but then leapfrogging embedded finance as we see it now, just like I really believe we will move in 5 to 10 years onwards on embedded finance offline, essentially. And I think it's going to be like the big next trend, like thinking about in the retail world specifically, but you have plenty different applications where essentially, as Neil was mentioning, we are going towards invisible banking, but it's not only an online trend. Embedded finance is getting traction. Maybe the next 5 years is mostly about internet applications, SaaS, etc. But it's coming, it's going to be much bigger. And I really believe it will have a societal impact, essentially.
I love that concept, invisible banking. It sounds so much more descriptive than embedded finance. 30 seconds, Neil, can you wrap this up here for what you expect to see in the future?
I will try in 30 seconds. So yeah, invisible banking is the future. Digital transformation is not going to stop. And I think with the emergence of new banking as service players that simplify the new propositions coming out to market, that's something definitely to watch. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the new central bank issued digital money piece that's hit the news recently. So 86% of central banks have already engaged on some form of CBDC activity today. And in fact, the UK's own Chancellor announced this week a task force to be set up for with the UK Treasury and Bank of England. So that's something I'm super excited about in terms of digital currencies and how governments might be looking at them. And then finally, environmental well-being. We talk a lot about financial well-being and our own personal well-being, but I think environmental well-being, consumers demand and are demanding to know if their buying choices are affecting the environment, how that is affecting the environment. And I think there's a whole plethora of new organizations. We've got a few under our belt who are helping the consumer make better buying decisions because of the information that they share with them. So environmental well-being is also something to be excited about.
Thanks, Neil. So 30 seconds for me to tie up. This has been a fantastic discussion with some superlative, amazing speakers. We've touched on a lot of things. I'm really, really excited about the future. We've got CBDCs coming down the pipe. We've got invisible banking. We've got leapfrogging and global and local partnerships. I am really delighted to hear you talk about environmental well-being. Thanks for that, Neil. Thank you so much, Sophie, Neil, Miles, Keith. It's been a great discussion, and hopefully everybody in the audience has enjoyed it.